Good evening. My name is Tibor Benjámin Szabó, Publishing Director of HVG Books Publishers, and it is a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight's event. Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI. As many of you know, HVG is one of the key players on Hungary's media market, along with news channels, magazines, and the publishing house. But it is also a center applied for business technology trainings and a platform for performance, conversation, and public debate. As a community of journalists, editors, and business technologists committed to the idea that knowledge is a public good, we regularly offer public programs featuring eminent thinkers, business leaders, and distinguished artists, addressing issues both pressing and perennial. In particular, I'd like to call your attention to the final keynote program of this year. On November 20th, we'll host a thought-provoking conference for leaders of a new era called AI Talks, Where Can We Go Together? The program is organized by HVG and Amazing AI and curated by István Szurop. Do mark your calendars. Now, there are software systems that can perform economically valuable tasks more efficiently than human agents with a high degree of autonomy. This is AI. Do we get superpowers from these devices, extended capabilities, an intelligent companion in thinking and working? Or do they serve as machine slaves, working for us 24 hours a day? Or is it the other way around? Could it be that the AI giants of Silicon Valley are actually the slave owners of humans preparing the chains that will be put on our feet? Tonight's book launch event is uniquely equipped to discuss these questions. First, we are delighted to welcome the distinguished author of our new book, Karen Hao. Ms. Hao studied at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, graduating with a BS in mechanical engineering and a minor in energy study in 2015. Currently, he is a freelancer for publications like The Atlantic, while previously a foreign correspondent based in Hong Kong for the Wall Street Journal and senior artificial intelligence editor at the MIT Technology Review. Her new book, Empire of AI, was longlisted by the Financial Times for Business Book of the Year award, and the Time magazine named the author among its 100 most influential AI experts. It is also a pleasure to welcome Tamás Szauer. Mr. Szauer studied at City University of London and Cass Business School, after which he obtained his master's degree at Imperial College London. Currently, he is the CEO of HVG Publishing Ltd. And previously worked for global companies such as Santander Bank, Deloitte, Bloomberg, and ING Bank. First, Karen Hao will give us her keynote speech on the background of the AI industry, after which Tamás Szauer and Karen Hao are going to discuss the most important insights from the book. Those who have a so-called signing ticket can also have their copy of the book signed at the signing session held at the end of the event. So, with no further ado, please welcome Karen Hao.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm So excited. Thank you to Tibor and Tamás for bringing me here and the HVG team. This is the first foreign edition of my book being launched globally. So it's a very big milestone for me, and yeah, I'm super excited to be sharing it with all of you. So I wanted to start by giving a bit of a brief summary of some of the core arguments of my book as a way of framing the conversation that we're going to have tonight. And really, Empire of AI, it tells the inside story of OpenAI, but it also uses that story to look at the history of this technology, the wide-ranging social and environmental impacts of this technology. And it is the accumulation of more than 7 years of work that I did reporting on the industry, on OpenAI, but also an even longer time of 10 years of work working in the tech industry myself as well, and grappling with questions about how do we ultimately develop technologies that are in the public interest. And the main question interwoven amid the drama of this very dramatic company is how do we govern artificial intelligence, which is one of the most consequential, if not the most consequential technology of our time. And that question really boils down to a much simpler one, which is how do we make sure that AI ultimately does more good than harm to society? One of the challenges of talking about AI today is that it is a very ambiguous term. So the term artificial intelligence, I sometimes say, is like the word transportation. The word transportation can refer to anything from bicycles to rockets, but clearly there are a wide range of different types of transportation that have very different designs, very different purposes, and they also have very different cost-benefit trade-offs. And so typically when we have a conversation about transportation, we have a much more nuanced one where we're asking things like, which kinds of transportations do we need more of? Which ones do we want less of? How do we evolve existing transportation like cars to electrify them, to improve them? And how do we also design fundamentally new forms of transportation that help people continue to move around, stimulate economic activity, but do not ultimately shortchange things like the environment? And this is something that we don't talk about when it comes to AI. AI is just this broad umbrella term where we don't have many distinctions about the way that we want this technology to be developed and deployed in society. But I think that that is where we need to have a nuanced debate, because just as with transportation, there are so many different types of AI technologies that could be similar to the bicycle or the rocket of AI. And they also have very different trade-offs. And in my book, what I argue is the type of AI technology that has captivated public imagination and that is really driving so much activity right now in Silicon Valley and beyond, these large-scale, quote-unquote, general-purpose AI models, is what I consider the type of AI that represents the worst possible cost-benefit trade-off. And if we really want to unlock the benefits of AI, we need to urgently shift the amount of capital and energy being deployed into this direction of AI development to a much broader range of AI technologies. And the reason why I'm really critical of these large-scale models is because I think that they ultimately exact a lot of harm on large swaths of society while accruing benefit to primarily a tiny group of people at the top. And this is why I call the companies that are leading the charge in this type of AI development the empires of AI. Why do I call them empires? There are really 4 parallels that I draw upon in the book between the empires of old and the empires of AI. First, they lay claim to resources that are not their own, but they pretend that those resources were always their own. So that refers to the data that they scrape from the internet and say that it's totally free and in the public domain. That refers to the intellectual property that they take from artists, writers, and creators and say that it's totally fair use under copyright law. Second, these empires exploit an extraordinary amount of labor. That refers to both the workers that ultimately these companies utilize to generate a lot of economic value for these companies, but rarely see that economic value in return. It also refers to the way that these technologies are being designed by companies like OpenAI as labor automating technologies. So when they get deployed into society, they begin to undermine labor rights. Third, these empires monopolize knowledge production. So what we've seen in the last 10 years is that the AI industry has become so wealthy that they're able to offer extraordinary compensation packages to AI researchers. You may have seen some recent headlines just this year about how Meta is offering compensation packages that can reach $100 million US dollars to some of these AI researchers. And what's happened is most of the AI researchers in the world are now being owned and dictated by these companies rather than doing research in the public interest. And so there's been a distortion in the fundamental science that we are able to see about what the true capabilities and limitations of the technologies that these companies are building actually are. And you could think of this distortion of science a bit similarly to if most of the climate scientists in the world were bankrolled by the oil and gas industry. We would not get a clear picture of the real climate emergency at hand. And in the same way, we are not getting a clear picture of what AI, the type of AI that Silicon Valley is developing, actually means for us. And fourth and finally, the last parallel between empires of AI and empires of old, all empires engage in this existential and moral imperative for their existence. So these companies portray themselves as the good empire. They're on a civilizing mission to bring progress and modernity to all of humanity. And if we allow them to have unfettered access to resources, to labor, to data, to land, to energy, to water, then somehow they are going to help us unlock a so-called AI utopia, a heaven where we are ultimately going to live in abundance and be free. But if we do not allow them these unfettered access, then the evil empire is going to get there first. Silicon Valley loves to portray China as the evil empire. And if the evil empire gets there first, instead of a heaven, we will end up in an AI hell. My critique of these large-scale AI models really comes down to one thing, which is their scale. So in the last few years, we've seen Silicon Valley dramatically escalate the amount of training data they use for a single AI model, as well as the amount of computational resources, or what they call compute, to be used in training a single model. And a way of looking at this is just through OpenAI's technologies. So between 2019 and 2023, OpenAI scaled their GPT models by 10,000 times. So that's 10,000 times more training data going into a single GPT model, 10,000 times more computational resources. And what's happened, what I report on in my book, is just when looking at scaling that training data, OpenAI made significant compromises in data quality as well as in intellectual property to reach the threshold that they were trying to reach through this scale. So with GPT-2, which was 1.5 models before ChatGPT, they were actually using curated websites and articles, around 8 million of them, to train the GPT-2 models. By GPT-4, 10,000 times greater in size, they were pirating books, and they were scraping YouTube to transcribe the videos against YouTube's policy terms of service in order to generate more training data. And they were also just indiscriminately scraping anything that they could find online that did not have some kind of ban on scraping to pour into their AI technologies. OpenAI is not alone in this regard. All of the major AI models leading in this type of AI development are doing exactly the same thing. And so when you look at the costs of training and AI models at this scale, what we see is the erosion of intellectual property rights, the exacerbation of a engagement-centric model of social media. We are increasingly seeing evidence that these companies are trying to make their products more and more addictive in order to harvest more user data to train the next generation of their models. You see more polluted data sets. And then you have a downstream impact of labor exploitation, because when you are training your models on the internet, and the internet has a lot of dark corners, you end up having to deal with the problem of content moderation. And in my book, I traveled to Kenya to meet some of the workers that OpenAI contracted to perform their content moderation for what would ultimately make ChatGPT a viral success. And what they asked these Kenyan workers to do was to wade through 8 hours a day for months on end some of the worst content on the internet in order to block that kind of content from being generated out of ChatGPT. For OpenAI, this was crucial because if they had not done this work, ChatGPT would not have been so popular. OpenAI would not have become a household name overnight. But for the workers themselves, they were left deeply traumatized, their families torn apart, and some of them completely unable to continue working, not just in that job, but any job afterwards because of the detriment to their psychology. The scaling of compute is leading to a whole other set of unprecedented challenges. And it's really hard to overstate how extraordinarily ridiculous the scale of computational resources Silicon Valley is trying to achieve. So I mentioned OpenAI scaled its models around 10,000 times in size. It used to be that AI models were trained on a single computer chip or maybe a few dozen computer chips. Now multiply that by 10,000 times, and a single model is being trained on tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of computer chips. These are supercomputers that are larger than have ever been built in human history. And Meta and OpenAI have both made plans to suggest that they want to build supercomputers that will be the size of the city of Manhattan, that will use the power demands of entire New York City or entire countries. And in fact, I did this calculation. There was a recent McKinsey report that found that if we were to project out the energy costs of the sheer amount of data centers and supercomputers that Silicon Valley wants to build, by 2030, these data centers in a conservative scenario would need 3.5 times more energy than this country, Hungary. And in an accelerated scenario, it would need almost 10 times the amount of energy consumed by this country's entire population. That, of course, also has extraordinary climate impacts. There was a United Nations report over the summer that found that the 4 leading AI companies have increased their emissions by 150% since 2020, which was exactly the year that they all promised to reduce their carbon emissions to 0 by the end of the decade. There's also water impacts to this infrastructure. Little talked about is the fact that these data centers and supercomputers, because they generate an enormous amount of heat, they need to be cooled, and most often they're cooled with fresh water. And the reason why it has to be fresh water is because any other type of water leads to the corrosion of the equipment or to bacterial growth. And Bloomberg recently had an investigation that found that 2/3 of these data centers are actually being built in water-scarce areas. And so there are people around the world that are actively competing with computers for life-sustaining resources. And I read about one of those communities in my book as well, from Montevideo, Uruguay, which I originally learned from an article in The Guardian. And I also went to Montevideo myself to meet some of the people there. They were undergoing such a historic mega drought that the Montevideo government was literally mixing salt water into the public drinking water supply because they wanted something to come out of people's taps. And for people who were too poor to afford bottled water, that was the water that they were drinking. And women were having higher rates of miscarriages. Elderly people with chronic illnesses were having exacerbated symptoms. And it was in the middle of this massive public health crisis that Google proposed to build a data center in the middle of Montevideo and use their already scarce fresh water to cool it. So if we go back to the analogy that AI is like transportation, I really think that generative AI is kind of like the rocket of AI. Generally speaking, we actually need there are very few transportation needs that actually require rockets. Like typically, when we deploy a rocket, we think about, is the use case that we are using the rocket for, do the benefits actually outweigh the cost of developing and deploying that rocket? We do not generally want everyone to have a rocket and use that rocket for all of their transportation needs. Like if you try to use a rocket to commute from Vienna to Budapest, that would make no sense. It's simply not designed for that purpose. We have much more specialized modes of transportation to serve those kinds of specialized needs. And we really, really need to shift our perspective with AI towards that direction as well. The scale that Silicon Valley is trying to deploy to create these large-scale general purpose models is actually completely unnecessary, because there are plenty of other types of AI technologies that can serve what we ultimately want in society, which is clean air, clean water, better healthcare, better transportation, a better environment. And ultimately, the types of AI models that could be used to give us those things are much smaller, much more specialized, much more task-specific. And even if we wanted generative AI models, we don't need the scale to achieve that either. We've seen with models like DeepSeek, for example, coming out of China, that you can get these general purpose models with significantly less computational resources and data in the first place. And so what I ask is, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we actively trying to envision a better future where AI technologies are built to serve our needs and also preserve our human and planetary health? One example that I really love of a type of AI technology that I think we need more of is DeepMind's AlphaFold. This is an AI model that was designed to accurately predict how a sequence of amino acids could fold into a protein, which is a really crucial step for understanding disease, for advancing drug discovery, and it won the Nobel Prize for chemistry just last year. This is an example of an AI system that was not trained on the internet, so it did not need content moderation, and therefore there was no labor exploitation. It did not need massive supercomputers. In fact, it was trained on a relatively small number of computer chips. And yet, at the other end, we receive extraordinary benefit. Another example, there's this nonprofit called Climate Change AI that I'm a huge fan of, that has done the hard work of cataloging all of the different types of targeted, specific challenges that we would need to overcome to mitigate the climate crisis. And they have also mapped out all of the different types of specialized AI technologies that could be used to target those challenges. Once again, none of this has anything to do with large-scale general-purpose models. These are small, specialized, data-efficient, computationally efficient, financially efficient, and we could get so much benefit on the other side. I wanted to end by just saying that I wrote my book before Trump was inaugurated for a second time, and we've seen a lot this year of images, I'm sure you've seen many of these images, of Trump standing side by side with all of the tech titans of the US. There's been a fusion of power between Silicon Valley and Washington. And the empire analogy has become so much more relevant. I think we are seeing now basically a modern day reprisal of the British East India Company abetted in its reckless expansion by the British Crown. And we are at a very, very dangerous and precarious moment where the continued expansion, imperial expansion of these companies would not just ultimately mean environmental fallout, public health crisis, or labor exploitation. I think we would be at threat of returning to an age of empire, and then democracy would not survive. And yet, I have never felt more hopeful that we can change that path. And I talk about some of the wonderful movements that I found along the way when I was reporting my book as well in the book. There's this beautiful story of this group called Mosacat. They're a Chilean water activist group. They also discovered in 2019 that Google was coming to build a data center in the town of Cerrillos, right outside of Santiago, which was planned to consume 1,000 times more fresh water than the residents of the town itself. Chile was also in a mega drought scenario. They didn't have enough fresh water for the people. Mossacat found this data center plan completely unacceptable. And so they went to the streets to protest. They started knocking on every single one of their neighbors' doors to explain to them what this data center project could actually do to their precious fresh water. They even explained this to the local government. And after widespread mobilization, Google was forced to concede to the community that they would no longer use fresh water to cool the facility. And not only that, the Chilean government created a roundtable to bring together tech companies, residents, and activists to discuss all future data center projects in the country. Mossacat's movement has inspired so many other movements around the world. There are dozens of communities that some of which I've met personally, that are protesting against extractive data center projects all around the world. And it's not just data center movements. We're seeing so many other collective movements beginning to emerge. Artists and writers that are suing these companies for taking their intellectual property without credit or compensation. Workers that are unionizing against harmful AI-enabled labor exploitation. Constituents that are demanding at every level of government for some kind of government regulation or legislation of AI use. Entrepreneurs and researchers that are imagining new ways of developing AI that is not so costly, but still extremely beneficial. Investors that are beginning to redirect their capital towards those new imaginations of what an AI future could become. And so, to end my remarks, I wanted to quote one of my favorite writers, Rebecca Solnit, and her book, Hope in the Dark. She talks about how hope is not the belief that everything is, was, and will be okay. Hope is actually the recognition that the future is uncertain. And in that uncertainty is the space to act. And so we must act, whether as individuals or in tandem with a few others or millions of others. And I hope that if there's one thing that you take away from tonight, is that every single one of us in this room has a responsibility, an opportunity to act individually and collectively to resist the empires, to imagine a different type of technology development, to fortify our collective futures. Because even though empires are made to feel inevitable, history has shown us that when people rise, empires always fall. Thank you.
Thank you for the beautiful presentation, Karen. And I think I can say in everybody's name that we are really glad you took a mere airplane and not a rocket to come here to Budapest to your book launch. I'm really glad that almost 600 people showed up on the very day that your book is launching in Hungary. So I would like to give a big applause for our crowd as well. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you all for being here.
And please take a seat. So good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tamás Szauer, and I'm here to pick Karen's brain on all things AI. But to kick off our conversation, I would like to share a fond memory of mine with you. Almost 10 years ago, I was sitting on this very stage talking to Martin Ford, who is the author of The Rise of the Robots, which we also published in Hungarian. And he told me that this time is different. He told me that the AI revolution will be different compared to all other technological developments that previously promised but under-delivered in an actual jobless future. So what is your take on Martin's remarks 10 years from now before? And do you think that actually 20 or 30 years from now, the jobs that people will do could be considered today as jobs, like a YouTuber today couldn't be considered as a job 20 years ago?
It's funny. It's a funny question given that there's so much talk of an AI bubble now. So it's interesting because I mentioned this in my book as well. I cite this other book written by two economists, Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson, MIT professors, who wrote this book called Power in Progress. And they analyzed 1,000 years of technology history and technology revolutions, and they actually found that it is a feature of all technology revolutions that there is hype, basically. And the reason why is because in order to consolidate a significant amount of resources to create a technology that leads to a technological revolution, you need to have some kind of rallying ambition. You need to hype people up, especially the people that have that hold the purse strings, to give money, to give their talent, to give resources to a particular technology. And so I actually don't think the AI revolution is any different. And these economists say in their book as well that it is no different. In fact, AI is the ultimate manifestation of this canonical feature of technology revolutions, because it has, AI has been around since the 1950s and 60s. And for 60 plus years, 70 plus years, it has been talking about all of the promises that we hear today. Like, there have been multiple waves of people saying that for sure it's just around the corner now, we're going to recreate AI, it's going to lead to all of this automation, it's going to lead to a complete cataclysmic shift in the way that society is organized and so on and so forth, and it's just never arrived. Yeah, so I still feel that way. And the other thing that the economists say in their book is that one of the other challenges of technology revolutions, and this ties also to the argument that I make, is that because many technology revolutions are resource intensive in the beginning, they end up adopting a shape that is in the image of the elites in society, the people that are the wealthiest and have a very particular conception of what they want the world to be and what they want this technology to do and how they want the technology to serve them, rather than a larger public. And the economists also argue that it's the same with AI, and I also argue it's the same with AI, that we are seeing right now these large-scale models in part because it is beneficial for Silicon Valley, but not necessarily beneficial for everyone else. And so I guess to the second part of the question, which is the future of jobs, I don't know that I want to make a prediction, because in general, I stray away from predictions. They assume a kind of inevitability of the future, and the whole message that I hope people take away is that the future is not inevitable. It is created by us through our actions today and tomorrow and the next day. And yeah, so I will abstain from the second part of the question.
Okay, I was really worried during your presentation that you're talking about a lot of things that I'm going to ask here as well. So I prepared some backup questions, and I think you're probably the only person in this room who has ever spoken with Sam Altman.
I've never spoken to him face to face.
Okay,
I've only messaged with him. Okay, so
this brings my next question slightly irrelevant, because I was going to ask, how is he in person?
He avoids me. That's why I've never spoken to him in person. I've asked him to sit with me for an interview many, many times, and he's always found an excuse for why he can't do that.
But I think in your book, you talk about him and other leaders as well, saying that they are not really geniuses. They have no chemical X in them. They are mere humans. But from my perspective, Altman and the others are master communicators. Or if I want to be cruel, I would say master manipulators. And wouldn't these count as genius as well? People who can form the future with their mere words.
I do think that I don't want to, they're not geniuses, that's correct. I don't want to put them on a pedestal. But also, they are clearly very talented people. They have unique capabilities that are not everyone has. And Sam Altman, what makes him singular is exactly that, his storytelling abilities and also his ability to understand human psychology. It's funny because Altman once remarked that he was quite fond of, maybe fond is not the right word, but he really admired Napoleon because Napoleon seemed to have a really, really good grasp of human psychology and therefore was able to manipulate people based on that. And he admired Napoleon because he felt like he didn't have that skill. But in fact, I think that he does have a very strong grasp of what makes people tick, what motivates people to do things. And that's how he ultimately drives his employees, investors, the public, policymakers, all towards a goal that he kind of has in his mind for how he's going to bring forward the future that he wants.
Isn't that the biggest difference between machines and humans? That
absolutely.
We can be manipulated by storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, well, also that that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, I would say so. And it's kind of ironic that like the skill that Altman is most profoundly good at is one that is so uniquely human, and yet he's leading an AI company that he keeps saying is going to replace all, skills that humans have needed up until present day.
So these AI companies, the one that he's leading as well, in terms of the number of people, they are a fracture of previous empires that you compare them to. Do you really think that these are empires? These are, from what I can tell, profit-oriented, or actually OpenAI, we can debate whether it's profit-oriented or not, in its corporate form not. But these are profit-oriented companies mostly that do that's best for them and their shareholders. Is that terrible, according to you, as an oppressing empire with an army that can literally oppress you physically?
Yeah, the thing about these companies, the reason why I draw an analogy to colonialism and not just capitalism is I actually don't think that these companies are purely profit-oriented. When you look at what drives them, it's not just money, because if it was just money, we would not be in the situation that we're in, where OpenAI is talking about spending trillions of dollars in the next less than 10 years, in the next 8 years, but has only generated tens of billions of dollars in revenue. Like that is, if it were truly a profit-oriented company, they would be dramatically trying to reduce their costs. But what's happening, in addition to a degree of capital incentive, is a huge ideological incentive. This belief that AI, that they are ultimately on this path to recreating a so-called artificial general intelligence, a theoretical AI system that is going to match or exceed human capabilities, and that this is going to have a profound impact on society, either in the positive direction, and those people I call the boomers, or people colloquially call the boomers, or in the negative direction, and those are colloquially called the doomers. But like the reason why they're pouring they say that they're going to pour trillions into this technology, is as much because they hope to make some money at the other end, as it is because they want to be the ones that usher in what they sometimes call an AI god. And like they want to be the ones that do that. And they also think that this is somehow going to unlock the next era of civilization for humans, or the next era of civilization with or without humans.
But after they got capitalized, for example, OpenAI, they really turned down their rhetoric about AGI, and now after GPT-5, they are just casually saying, let's make a search engine or a browser and make AI porn freely available. So they are pivoting towards making money instead of bringing a digital god.
They are doing that publicly, but privately, they still very much lean into the AGI rhetoric. And that's not just privately within the company, like the employees. One of their primary recruiting tactics for AI researchers is to say, like, do you not want to join a mission-driven organization that's trying to create an AI god? Like, do you not want to be part of a civilizational milestone? But also to policymakers. Like, they talk to policymakers about how this technology is going to continue accelerating, it's going to be all-powerful, and therefore it needs to be in the hands of the US. And like they talk about it like it's an AI Manhattan project, and it needs to be like safeguarded, in a national security kind of way. So even as they publicly, to the markets, to investors, to consumers, have dialed down that rhetoric, behind closed doors, it's still being amped up significantly, because that's what continues to persuade people when looking at the financial numbers, which don't make sense, to keep going, to keep contributing, to keep giving OpenAI time and space and yet more resources to try and pull off this thing that they say they're trying to do.
What you said as a recruiting tactic, you've been covering OpenAI since 2019, as I remember correctly. Back then, it could have worked really well, but fast forward today, it almost feels like The Life of Brian, the movie in which people say, we are the Israel Liberation Army. No, we are the army for liberating Israel. So everybody has the same message that, we want to bring the digital god. So how do talented people actually choose in Silicon Valley on where to work?
It's very complicated. It is a mix, once again, of ideology and of commercial incentives. So, these companies, as I mentioned, the talent war is insane. And these companies fight with one another for what is ultimately a limited pool of AI researchers. And so Meta has engaged in the tactic of just trying to outspend every other company by offering them $100 million compensation packages. That works for some people, like some AI researchers that I've spoken to who have received the $100 million compensation packages. They say, I don't necessarily agree with Meta. I don't necessarily know if Meta's gonna be the one that ushers in this new era. But $100 million is transformative. It's like intergenerational wealth for me and my family, so I'm just gonna take it. So that's like one end of the spectrum. And then there are other people, it's like, okay, then why isn't everyone working at Meta, Because they've tried to poach plenty of researchers across the companies who have then said no, and those researchers have instead settled for a measly couple $1 million in compensation. And for those people, it's because they want to be with a mission-oriented, value-oriented company. Anthropic is particularly one of the main competitors of OpenAI that actually split off former OpenAI executives that left OpenAI to create Anthropic. They're one of they lean quite heavily in this direction of saying we are the good guys, OpenAI's evil, Meta's evil, all of the other companies are evil, you should definitely be working for us, and that is how you're going to be on the right side of history. Thinking Machines Lab, which is Mira Murati, the former chief technology officer of OpenAI, she just started her own company. Quite similar, she's like, all of these companies are now becoming more and more closed off, and she is trying to build an organization that is more open source focused. So she recruits people based on that. Don't you want to make a contribution to the public, continue having open science? So it's the same thing. There are a lot of ideological and money-driven battles that tug these researchers and these engineers in different directions.
Yes, and as far as I know, Mira Murati has the ear of the president of Albania to bring alive an AI minister, actually. So it must sound good that you can actually experiment with a true existing country, even though if it's small. But other master communicators like Sam Altman has the ear of a much more powerful person, the most powerful person of the free world, Donald Trump. And zooming out from the personal to the macro level, what is your take on the race between the US and China in terms of AI? Who's going to win this? And just to give our audience an idea of how an important question is this, Jensen Huang, who is the founder and CEO of NVIDIA, the company with the largest market capitalization in the world currently, over $5 trillion, has openly said that China doesn't look like it's going to win the race. It is going to win the race.
Yeah. I do not like the race narrative at all. I think it is a narrative that was really driven by Silicon Valley that has now captivated a lot of people's imaginations. And the reason why Silicon Valley drove that narrative is because it's the best argument that they've ever found to maintain an anti-regulatory stance within the US government. So Silicon Valley says, you know, don't regulate us, regulate China through chip export controls. They say this to the US government. And then our technology platforms, American technology platforms, are going to have a liberalizing effect on the world, and we're also going to just leave China in the dust. And over the last 10 years of this argument playing out, where the US government literally followed exactly what Silicon Valley said and was locked in this race mentality, the exact opposite has happened. There's never been a narrower margin between the US and China, and as Jensen says, he thinks that China is going to win. But also, Silicon Valley's had an illiberalizing effect on the world. Like that has become just proven again and again and again that like the social media companies of that era have not done anything to help with democracy, with fortifying human rights around the world. It's done exactly the opposite. Jensen, of course, is trying to continue to stoke the race narrative, and partly because of a different reason than the other companies. He's not just trying to ward off regulation, he's also just trying to sell more product. Like if he tells people in the English language media, China is winning, what are people going to do in the US? Buy a ton of his computer chips to try and beat China. So his profits are soaring. He's crossed $5 trillion of value for his company. And I don't know what he's saying to like Chinese leaders, but probably something slightly different than what he's saying in the English language media. But he's happily kind of playing all sides, and not just US and China, he's also going to South Korea. He just had that trip in South Korea where there were photos of him locking arms with the president of Samsung, I believe it was, drinking beer or drinking shots. And he was using this idea of gaining technological sovereignty in the country to once again sell more of his computer chips. He's striking these enormous deals by going to every single country being like, don't you want technological sovereignty? I have a solution for you, NVIDIA GPUs. Yeah, so this race narrative I really do not think actually helps facilitate a healthy discourse or healthy decision-making for the broader global population, because ultimately, like, we do have existential threats that face us, aka climate change. And the way to overcome this is through more global cooperation, not through a narrative where everyone thinks it's a zero-sum game. And it doesn't matter who is going to win the race, the US or China, if they're ultimately not working together, like, we have no Earth anymore. And so, like, I very much am trying with this book and in other ways to shift the narrative focus away from this idea of an AI arms race or that kind of rhetoric to one where people recognize that we need to return back to a model where global cooperation is essential for our survival as a whole.
I'm not letting you off the hook this easily in this question, because what you're saying, if we remove AI as a word from the equation and replace it with nuclear arms race, it could be copy-paste of what you said. And I think I can tell in the name of all Hungarians sitting here that it was really important for us who won that nuclear arms race and which ideology prevailed after the fall of the Soviet Union. So do you really not think that there is a difference if either of those superpowers win this AI race, regardless of you liking the race or not?
I don't think that there's actually a clean analogy between AI and nuclear, because these are fundamentally different technologies. So nuclear is it's a physical technology, right? Like, you have nuclear weapons that are discrete and they have been built and they exist, and we know exactly what they look like, we know exactly what they're going to do. None of those features are true for AI. It's a digital technology that crosses borders. No matter how you try to contain AI, it's software, and it's just going to continue crossing borders and proliferating wherever. It's also, like, these companies talk about an artificial general intelligence. That's not a technology that exists. It's a theoretical idea. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know how it's going to work. We don't know what impact it's going to have. And so it's like they use the nuclear rhetoric to retrofit onto the AI narrative to make it seem really clean cut, but it's not. Like, these are actually totally different technologies. And in the history of AI development, actually like the norm all the way up until very recently was not a race at all. It was very much based in cross-border collaboration. The US and China were actually the #1 collaborators, and actually still today are the #1 collaborators in AI research. People just don't talk about it anymore. But one of the most important innovations in AI before the generative AI boom was this thing called a residual neural network. This is like the most important piece of like software architecture for AI models before the transformer, which is now the new software architecture for generative AI models. The residual neural network was invented by Chinese researchers working in Microsoft's Beijing office. It emerged from a literal collaboration between the US and China, and it unlocked all of these advancements in healthcare, in computer vision, in other types of applications that are ultimately beneficial for anyone around the world, not just Americans, not just Chinese citizens, but like literally anyone. And that was actually all the way until like 4 years ago, that was considered the norm, something that we should continue building upon, like having this cross-border scientific collaboration, because it is going to create more beneficial and safer AI systems for everyone. And it's only literally since ChatGPT emerged that the public discourse has completely shifted to an AI arms race. And so that's not that much time, like that's very little time in which a narrative was seeded and has taken over, but we can just as easily return back to what it actually used to be.
So you said that it is not a physical, it is a software-related race. So it is not as harmful as nuclear power can be or nuclear bombs can be. But I think it was last week, or maybe the week before the last week, that Brent Bornich, who is the CEO of 1X Robotics, introduced a new robot called Neo and offered it for pre-ordering. I think it's really funny that it's called Neo. It has a very different connotation. I think that most people would associate with robots. It's quite the opposite, as far as I know from the movie Matrix. But this is either cute or creepy-looking fabric-covered robot, and Bernd had a really interesting narrative. He said that a robot learning to navigate the physical environment is very difficult, because if it watches the entire video content on YouTube, it still only has a fraction of idea what the real world is like. Mm-hmm. And he said something that I think you would really like, but he got to a very different conclusion. He said that the videos on YouTube are a very bad representation of what being a human is. But his conclusion was that, okay, now let's put a robot in everybody's home with a camera so that we can really know what humans are like. So in a sense, AI is coming to the physical world in terms of robotics.
That is true. It is also taking a really long time. Like, this is, yeah, the embodiment of AI systems is, as he said, one of the toughest technical challenges, because there is a lack of data for training these physical manifestations of AI technologies. So most of the robotics that we actually see diffused around the world today, whether like manufacturing robots or whatever, actually have none or only a little bit of AI in them, because the best way to guarantee robotic systems at the moment and their safe operation is to largely program them deterministically, to just give them a set of hard-coded rules for how they should move in the world. So yeah, it is something that is potentially on the horizon, that we will see more AI-powered robots in the future, but it is actually far further away than what a lot of these companies suggest, because they are trying to point to the rapid acceleration of large language models as somehow evidence that there's going to be a similar rapid acceleration in robotics, but the types of AI technologies that power robots are not large language models, so this is like a totally perpendicular thing. Like, you can't draw parallels between those two things. The reason why large language models in part have accelerated so quickly is because there's a lot of language data on the internet that was easy to scrape and easy to collect and easy to put into the models. And to his point, like, in order to get robots, to scale the training data just as quickly for robots, you would need to just create, you know, a surveillance world where every single person is surveilled at all times in order to generate that much data.
Yeah, and he said that they will create a surveillance world. They have 10,000 pre-orders for this Neo robot, and he said that they plan to keep these on all the time. So within a year, they will have more training data from these 10,000 units than the entirety of YouTube. So we will see. And also we'll have a person called Emily Krotowski on the 20th of November at our AI Talks conference, who is the first person in Europe who is actually living together with a robot. And she's going to tell us her experiences. So from her perspective, fast forward, it is going to be slow until a robot is actually able to wash your dishes and fold your clothes. But back to our conversation. In your book, I think, from what I read, one of your biggest, if not the biggest concern with AI development is environmental. And since the Industrial Revolution, all technologies have had environmental costs. And if we would have extrapolated that technology to the future, we would have arrived by now already to a catastrophe on Earth. But we haven't, because they improved. Don't you think that there is a possibility, or not just a possibility, a very well-defined self-interest for humanity to speed up the progress of this technology so that we can avoid such a future scenario that we are deploying AI in such a barbaric way in terms of using technology and resources?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, first of all,
this is the narrative of Bill Gates, that we always have to out-innovate ourselves from catastrophic scenarios.
Yeah, I think first of all, the problem is that during the Industrial Revolution, there was a completely different level of urgency for the climate catastrophe that we face today, because we have continued to pump more and more emissions into the atmosphere, and that is now reaching, like, very rapidly reaching the tipping point that scientists say could become irreversible and lead to profound ecological devastation. And, like, the thing is, like, the concern is not that the Earth will go away. The concern is that Earth will become inhabitable for us. Like, the Earth will be fine. It will continue to exist, but, like, we will not be fine under the conditions of under the conditions of what would emerge if we continue pumping that much carbon into the atmosphere. The other thing is, like, when you literally look at what is happening right now with the amount of where capital is being put into, like, which technologies, climate tech and energy tech, like the actual technologies that we need to innovate out of these problems, is being, like, the money is being pulled to then put into large language models. So, like, earlier this year, in Q1 of this year, almost 50% of venture capital money in the US went to just OpenAI and Anthropic. So almost 50% of literally the like largest base of capital investment that goes into new technology innovations was going into large language models. And, like, that money is primarily coming from other things like climate tech. Like, they are like redistributing the capital away from climate technologies towards these large language model technologies. And so, like, Bill Gates can say whatever he wants, but the reality is that we are not in any way distributing our capital and our talent and our energy and all the things that typically are required inputs for innovation towards anything that is helpful for the climate crisis right now.
Yes, but you could also argue that this is both a bug and a feature of capitalism itself. Capital allocation can be wrong sometimes based on inaccurate or false informations, but in a long enough time horizon, it corrects its mistakes. So are you actually just criticizing capitalism in general, or this particular asymmetric information problem?
I am critical of like letting capitalism be the only incentive in society. Yeah, I mean, I think generally, I think most people would agree with that. Like if you just allow capitalism to be the only, like just to have a complete, like a libertarian point of view, where you just allow markets to determine things, we are not going to ultimately get to a better world, because there are so many things that we need in society that don't actually have that much economic value. And to your point, like in a long enough time horizon, the market's correct, we don't have a long time horizon anymore. And so that's why, in general, like in the European model, there's always been capitalism, but also like regulation to change the incentives such that innovation is not just towards what has economic value, but also what has public value. And I very much believe in that balance. You need to balance the capital incentives with other types of incentives in the public interest in order to have a healthy innovation ecosystem. You
said the following on a CNBC interview. Now I got it correct, not CNN, but CNBC. So I quote, "I don't use generative models from companies engaging in environmental, social, and labor harms." So letting our audience in on a private joke that I made to you on Saturday, I coined this mindset as techno-veganism. Meaningful, but very hard to scale on a social level. So what do you think, so what would you say to those who argue that this is ethical abstention from AI, and it is more of a privilege rather than an actual strategy for everybody in the room to follow?
So the first thing that I said to Tamás on Saturday when he asked me this question is, well, I am also vegan, so it makes sense that I would also be a techno-vegan. And I really love that somehow I would 100% agree, it is a form of techno-veganism. And I do acknowledge that it is from a place of enormous privilege that I'm able to abstain from these technologies. Like I've met many people who around the world while I've been on book tour that have explained to me why they have to use these technologies, either because their boss requires it of them or they will be fired, or like I spoke with a freelance journalist at one point who was like, I use it to create an estimated cost of what my work will be, because when clients email me, I know that like any fractional seconds that I can gain to be ahead of anyone else sending their estimated cost of work is like one more client that will ultimately choose me versus someone else. And like given the precarity of his situation, like I would never tell him, oh, you're a terrible person for using generative AI in that way. And so I never tell people to not use the technology. What I say is like, I don't use it. You can choose what your stance is. I just really want there to be more awareness of what the cost of this technology actually is. Because at the moment, there's very little conversation about the cost, and it's mostly just Silicon Valley dictating that it's going to have tremendous benefit and that it's going to be inevitable and that anyone who doesn't use this technology is going to be replaced by someone who does. Like, these are all bogus narratives that just ultimately allow Silicon Valley to gain more power and gain more wealth. But I would say, like, if you find in your life that you do genuinely feel that it is absolutely necessary to use these technologies, use it. But then consider, what are ways to shift away from companies like OpenAI and use other vendors that are more value aligned with the kind of world that you want to see. And what I mean by that is consider using open source models instead of closed source models. I think open source models, while they do also sometimes get built with similar data privacy concerns or labor exploitation concerns or environmental concerns, at the very least, every time you use the technology, it is not giving your data to these companies and ceding more power to the empires. And also, like, these open source technologies are often like significantly more efficient when they're developed. And so like one resource that I would point people to is this company called Hugging Face, which is a platform that hosts all of these different open source models. They recently created a website that is their version of ChatGPT, basically, that uses only open source models to power it. Like, I would recommend people try using that instead of OpenAI or Anthropic's Claude or Google's Gemini or whatever. But the other thing that I would hope is that obviously we don't have enough alternatives right now. That's why people feel like if I have to use it, I have to use one of these like vendors that have dubious ethical track records. And so I also really hope that like if there are researchers, entrepreneurs, investors in this room, like those are the types. We need more alternatives. We need people to invest in alternatives so that people can use these technologies without having to compromise in those types of ways.
So we're moving on to the last question before we open the floor for further questions. We discussed this already as well privately, but just to share this news with our audience in case they might have missed it, there is a company called Character AI, which is one of the poster childs of the LLM wave after the release of ChatGPT. And it was a very successful company, probably still is, but it has directly caused the death of a teenager by having one of its characters encourage a poor person and drive him into suicide. After this, there was a huge backlash towards the company, and I think 2 weeks ago, the company has announced that it is banning everybody under the age of 18 from its models from the end of November onwards. So, does this make you hopeful about the future of AI? And in general, what makes you hopeful about the future of AI? And what would a healthier AI future look like to you?
I think this is a really important example that does make me quite hopeful in that it proves that these things are not inevitable. In fact, that teenager who killed himself using character AI's technology, this is not a unique story. I actually just reported this week about a spate of 7 new cases and 7 new lawsuits that were filed against OpenAI, 4 of which involve suicides. And that's on top of another teenager that also killed himself using ChatGPT. So that's 5 suicides now associated with ChatGPT. And this is, like the character AI situation is a perfect example of when you hold these companies accountable, they have to change. There was so much public backlash that it became untenable for character AI to hold the position of continuing to give its technology to children. And recently, like OpenAI, under all of this pressure, has also been changing. They have been trying to figure out ways to put more safety mechanisms into their technologies. They're hiring a lot more mental health experts to try and figure out how to prevent these suicides, but they only did this after the public backlash. And speaking with like employees at the company, they mentioned that this was a concern that they literally knew in advance, but it was just very under-resourced at the company. And it was because of the huge PR crisis that there's now more resources going into this problem. And so that's what I meant when I said at the end of my talk that like every single one of us has a role to play, because all of us actually have so many different touch points with the full AI development supply chain. All of us have had data that has been taken to train these models, for sure. All of us are consumers that either choose to consume or not to consume these technologies. All of us have collectively can like assert when we disagree with what companies do, when they do things that feel so egregious that there is this outpouring against what the company's decisions have been. And many of us live near data centers, and I talked about how there's like movements around the world that are now protesting these data centers. So these are all different touch points in each of your lives in which you can decide whether to agree with what's happening or disagree and contest and resist what's happening in various ways. So for example, like I mentioned, like I don't use these tools. That's my disagreement as a consumer. I also deleted all of my personal social media after generative AI started becoming a thing. That's my disagreement as a data provider. I refuse to provide them that training data for training their models. And once again, this is like a privileged stance, but like to whatever extent you have those privileges as well, it is your responsibility to actively engage and contest what these companies do. And we all also, in various ways, elect people to represent us and to pass regulation and legislation. So that's another way that we can hold them accountable by declaring to leaders that these are important issues that we want them to prioritize. And so I do think, ultimately, I'm extremely hopeful because of the fact that there is so much opportunity to change how AI ultimately is developed. And what I hope, like I guess the future of what I want AI development to be, there's this story that I talk about in the epilogue of my book. It's about this organization called Tahiku Media in New Zealand. It's a radio station, a nonprofit radio station that broadcasts in Te Reo Maori, which is the language of the Maori indigenous people. And the reason why I wrote about this story is because they were trying to figure out how to ultimately take their archival audio, which is all of this rich audio of them conducting interviews in Te Reo Maori, and opening it up to the rest of the Maori community, which has been trying for decades now to revitalize their language because it was almost lost during their history of colonization. And they realized that the only way to do that was to develop an AI speech recognition tool for transcribing this audio. And they went about developing this AI system in a fundamentally different way from how OpenAI or Silicon Valley develops things. First of all, they went to their community and asked, do you want this AI technology? Once the community said yes, then they moved on to the next step, which was to educate the community about what would it take to build an AI tool. Well, we're going to need data. And they got everyone involved in this, like this community competition to provide high quality data for training their speech recognition model. And because the community was bought into the idea, had consented to the idea, fully trusted this organization to do the right thing with their data, they were able to collect all the data they needed in less than a week. And it wasn't that much data either. It was only a couple hundred hours of audio, which is a fundamentally different scale from like OpenAI has also developed a speech recognition tool and they used hundreds of thousands of hours of audio. So that's because like OpenAI is ultimately trying to create this general purpose tool. So they require extraordinary amount more data extraction, but this community was working with a specialized AI tool, and so it required a much more minimal data footprint. Once they gathered the data, they were able to train that model. They were then able to work with the community continually to figure out how to use these AI technologies to serve the community's interests. That is the future that I imagine for AI. Every community in this world, whether it's a company or a school or a government agency or literally like a local city community, should have the ability to develop AI tools for them, by them, in a way that fortifies the future that they want to have.
Karen, thank you very much for the conversation. I would like to open the floor for questions now. We will have time for a maximum of 5 questions. And my colleague on the right, on your left, has the microphone. So please, if you have questions, raise your hand and she will give you the microphone. Oh, here, Hanna, at the back, the other side. Sit tight because we only have one microphone due to technical errors that we can give to you. So my colleague is very speedy, but not lightning speed. There we go.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation and the talk. It was very insightful. My question that you mentioned that you think that the nuclear missiles are very different technology than AI, because the former is physical and the latter one is not physical at all. It's an algorithm and programs and software. Yeah, it's true, because if you have an algorithm, you can describe it with, I don't know, a handful of lines of mathematical formulation. It's totally fine. But when you want to run this code, it requires resources, as you mentioned, a lot of water, a lot of computational capacity, material resources like rare metals required for the chip technology. And we can see that only a couple of countries and system controls them. So this is the source of the rivalization between America and China, because China rules the sources of these rare metals, and that's why Trump wants to get Greenland to compensate this stuff. So for me, it looks very physical at this point, when it's an applied stuff.
Yeah, that is a good point. There is obviously a physical dimension to the technology, which I talk about extensively as part of the argument for why the environmental concerns are so harmful for AI development. But I still think that there's a distinction with nuclear technologies in that with the nuclear arms race, it was quite clear that it was possible to create a nuclear weapon, and that if you explode a nuclear weapon, it's going to be like extraordinarily devastating, and this is a weapon of war. AI, it's not, like, there are so many different types of AI, and the type of AI that is used in weapons actually has nothing to do with large language models. So once again, like, this race where Silicon Valley is describing a race where they need to build all these supercomputers to build just larger and larger large language models is completely, like, unrelated to the type of AI that would be used in warfare. Like, a lot of the technologies used in warfare are incredibly simple and ones that we've already had for at least a decade. For example, like drones that have computer vision capabilities. That is something that has nothing to do with large language models. It's already something that we have had around. And the only thing that's changed about AI deployment in warfare is a normative one, not a technological one. Because with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, there has been an erosion of norms around autonomous warfare, that there used to be a much harder line where it was like, we're not going to use AI for certain types of weaponry. That has now gone away. And so it's still different in that, like, with nuclear, like, the race was, if we get to a weapon first, it is going to have, like, that's why there was a race, because it was the creation of a weapon. But these large language models that we're racing towards have a completely, it's like perpendicular to the types of AI technologies that are used in warfare.
Thank you for the question from the gentleman. Please propose an actual question, not just a statement, although it was really insightful. Next question,
okay.
Please.
Hi, my name is Gergely Takács from Budapestre AI, and my question is that now all of the web has been scraped, at least the public parts. It's obviously important for the LLM companies to get more data. That means they need to tap into, like, private sources of data, like messages, smartwatches, IoT, and so on. And how do you think they are going to get this their need met? What are other considerations which may threaten our privacy? And also, do you think this browser they are developing are part of the scheme to make more data for the AI to train?
It's a really great question. You're absolutely right that these companies are really scrambling to find new sources of data. Part of it is not just that they've scraped the web, because of course there's like more and more content being generated on the web every day. It's that they're cannibalizing their own data set, because now so much of the web is AI generated content. And when you train an AI model on AI generated content, there's this thing that happens called model collapse, where the model just stops working. And so they're trying to find not just new sources of data, but new sources of pure data that's not AI generated. And a lot of this is they're trying to tap straight into the user. as I mentioned, they're trying to create their technologies to be more and more addictive and to harvest more and more data from the user. A big part of their marketing around these technologies as general purpose is also meant to try and generate more varieties of data from users, because if you tell users you can use this technology for anything, then they will truly try using it for anything, and that's a really broad diversity of data that they can then harvest and try to continue training new capabilities. But we are starting to see more and more like physical surveillance in the world as well. Like these companies will hire third-party firms that their job is to then generate data from the physical world by like going out and filming things to capture like real-world data from the environment, or like filming people. Like there's a whole industry, cottage industry of these types of firms that will like go onto college campuses, for example, and like offer university students free food in exchange for like giving their face or like letting them be filmed doing various things. And yeah, and also devices. So we've seen, as part of like this move towards physical surveillance, we've seen a lot of these AI device, ever-present AI device companies emerge, like the AI friend, where it's like a necklace that you're supposed to wear with a camera that's on at all times. And like OpenAI has also mentioned that they want to develop a device that will be on and listening and watching at all times. So all of these are different ways, different plays for capturing ever more expansive and intimate data.
The lady on your right has the next question.
Hi, I wanted to ask that in your research, did you notice that AI seems to please the consumer first and be factual second? And if you think that's due to profit incentives or something else?
Great question. So it's two things. Fundamentally, large language models are a probabilistic technology. They are generating sentences by understanding how language is typically used and which words appear most often next to each other, in what order, and then they regurgitate it out. So like every sentence that these models create is generated on the fly, right? And that inherently means that you will never have 100% accuracy. Because when you're generating sentences on the fly based on the probabilities of how often words appear next to each other, yes, like there will be often times when it's correct, but there's oftentimes it might also drop a word like no or not, and suddenly the meaning of the sentence is completely flipped. And so there was like a researcher once said it to me really well that like there's a term for this called hallucinations, which refers to the way that these models have error rates. I don't love the term because it suggests that it's fixable, that you can somehow make a technology that doesn't hallucinate, but it's not fixable. A researcher mentioned at one point, like, if you want these technologies to be able to generate sentences on the fly and not just be copying and pasting sentences from like a repository of sentences, you will have hallucinations, because that's just, it comes hand in hand. And actually OpenAI admitted this recently, where they, for a long time, were like, hallucinations are fixable, and then a month ago they were like, just kidding, hallucinations are not fixable, they're inherent to the technology. So that's the first, at a baseline, why they will just, they don't prioritize factual accuracy because they can't. But then on top of that, you're absolutely right that there is a huge commercial incentive for the companies to also design these technologies to say what people want to hear. And given that there was no attachment to factual grounding in the first place, then you just end up with these systems that will say like anything and everything based on what the user wants to hear.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, the gentleman in the middle, please.
Thank you. Can you imagine restrictions are coming, so you couldn't upload videos, can scraping, or ask whatever you want? So is there an option?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question? Is there an option?
So there is an option, restriction coming. So you couldn't upload to the Videos or scraping or any options, what it's too data consuming?
There have been a number of things underway that could potentially restrict or leave open the ability to do this. There have been a lot of different lawsuits that have been filed, both in the US and the UK, maybe in parts of Europe. I'm not as familiar with the European litigation landscape, but a lot of content creators who uploaded this data in the first place are suing these companies, saying that it's a violation of copyright law. There has not been a definitive interpretation yet by the courts of whether or not it was, and like they could end up interpreting, yes, it was a violation, and then it would start restricting the ability of companies to do that, or they could say that it's not, and then the companies can just continue doing it with new legal backing. Another effort is like the EU AI Act does actually have a transparency clause. Hasn't been enforced yet, but it does say that the companies would be required to give some level of transparency into the training data that they use for their models. If that were enforced, and it's unclear like to what degree of transparency the companies would need to provide, I think that would be a pretty key mechanism for companies to be much more careful about where they get their data from. Because if they have to answer to the public every single time they're using certain types of data sources, they will make sure the data is more clean and doesn't, like, the source of the data doesn't cause like a PR crisis for them. And so, yeah, there are different efforts on the way, but it's not nearly enough. And there needs to be definitely more efforts to restrict what companies do in this regard.
Last question, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. Could you please elaborate your thoughts with regards to labor market and the possibility of opting out the usage of AI, and or how do you consider it to be possible to use it in a proportionate manner, given the fact that Mr. Sam Altman, when talking to Bill Gates, is encouraging everybody to use AI more and more, and please consider shadow AI, slum AI, and other phenomena as well. Thank you for your answer in advance.
Yeah, so I do think that the current development of AI from Silicon Valley could have a huge impact on labor. Not necessarily because these technologies, for two reasons. One, these technologies can automate away certain things. And I talk in my book about how like these technologies have very uneven capabilities. In some places they're extremely good, in other places they're extremely bad. Part of the reason why is like the inherent probabilistic nature of the models, but the other reason is because OpenAI targets very specific industries for the tasks that they train their models to automate. And the industries that they target are the ones that are the most lucrative ones, like media, entertainment, finance, law, because those are the industries that they ultimately want to sell their product to in order to try and recoup all of their spending dollars. And so there will be, if we allow these companies to continue doing what they're doing, there will be a huge impact on those types of jobs, the ones that they have explicitly targeted for automation. There will also be a lot of impact on jobs simply because there are many executives that are being convinced by the Sam Altmans of the world that they can automate their workers away, even if the technology is in fact not up to the task. Because ultimately, people fire other people. It's not the AI that fires the other people. It's the executives that fire their workforce and then install AI models to do the work. And there have been a number of cases in which executives have then discovered that the AI cannot, in fact, do the work, and then they've had to awkwardly rehire their workers back. But there are other cases where they're like, the AI is just not as good, but whatever, it's way cheaper. So they just keep with the AI instead. And I think in terms of like AI adoption, I guess like my main, the main thing that I hope that people will take away on the question of adoption is, I think in general, the adoption question's been collapsed into a binary. It's like either you use it for everything or you don't use it at all. But in fact, there's like so many different options in between those two. And ultimately, like, I would encourage you first, as I mentioned, to think about which vendors you're using the technologies from. Second, to think about what are the things that you ultimately need to do to advance your career, and what are the goals that you have to advance your career. One of the reasons why I don't use this technology is because as a journalist, my core skill set is empathy and storytelling. And I do not find that these AI models help me with either. And that's part of the reason why I'm also able to have the privilege of abstaining, because it just doesn't actually help me in my job. And I would encourage people to ask yourself, what are the core skills that you need, and does AI actually help you in that way? And then ask which type of AI actually helps you in that way. It might not be a large language model. And then the final thing I would say is, I've spoken with so many different employees of different companies who say that they receive an enormous amount of pressure from their bosses to use AI, even if it's not actually helpful to their job. And I would say, if hopefully you are in an environment where you can push back, but don't push back alone. Find your other colleagues who feel exactly the same way and push back as a group, and ask for an actual conversation with your managers, with the executives of your company, about a more nuanced AI adoption policy that ultimately also helps serve the company's mission and mitigates the risk of adopting AI technologies in ways that are not thoughtful or vetted.
That was an excellent final word. Thank you, Karen, and thank you for the questions. Everyone, please remain at your seats, because we have two important things, or actually three. The first is that we are going to publish our interview with Karen in this week's HVG. Also, it is going to be live on hvg.hu in about 30 to 40 minutes. But this is not what I actually wanted to say. What I wanted to say is that since this is hopefully going to be a very fond memory of you, please remain at your seats while you applaud Karen for this excellent speech and night, because we want to commemorate this evening from our personal angle and take a selfie with the crowd. And the second thing is my colleague Tibor is going to give you some information on the process of dedication and the purchase of the books. So please, Tibor, join us on stage, and please everybody give a big applause for Karen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's do a selfie.
Yeah. So, before we take this selfie, in the spirit of data privacy, for anyone that does not want to have their face in the photo,
Opt out now.
in front of the photo. And I think not only will it be great for you, I think it'll be a nice statement as well of consent.
Karen, Tamás, thanks both of you for this illuminating, if not subversive composition. Karen, thank you so much for your brilliant speech. Önöknek pedig köszönjük, hogy eljöttek, a kitüntető figyelmet, kérem jöjjenek máskor is. A rendezvény pódiumos része ezzel befejeződött, de kérem ne feledjék, hogy aki dedikáló jegyet vett, ez tudja dedikáltatni a könyvet a szerzővel, hátul ott a sarokban néhány perc múlva indul a dedikálás, illetve aki nem dedikáló jegyet vett, az pedig a másik sarokban hozzá tud jutni a könyvhöz, higgyék el, érdemes. Még egyszer köszönöm szépen, hogy itt voltak, viszontlátásra!